My name is Cindy Lynn. I'm with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and the first United States Environmental Protection Agency. Yes, EPA. Sometimes I say EPA, you folks, maybe not you guys, and they don't know what I'm saying, so I oftentimes will try to spell it out. First, I want to thank all of you for coming this evening. I know that you're taking valuable time away from your family and from probably having a nice dinner, but that just, for me, speaks to the fact that there's a lot of passionate folks in this watershed who really care. So really from the, I really appreciate all of you guys being here tonight, so thank you. Just a couple of housekeeping. In case some of you don't know, but I found out that the bathroom is to the right when you go out the hallway. Okay, so before I start, there's a couple things I'm going to start off with, and then I'll kind of give you a lay of the land for this evening of what we're going to talk about. But first I wanted to speak about the purpose of the workshop this evening. And the purpose of the workshop is really to provide information to the public. It is an important role for our EPA, for the Environmental Protection Agency, to actually give information to the public, and that is actually why we're holding this informal public workshop. And I want to emphasize informal because it is what I would like to do is to have a conversation with you folks and hear your comments, your concerns, recommendations that you have about the process. What I will be covering is, many of you heard about a TMDL. That's a total maximum daily load. I'll talk a little bit more about what that is. And about the process, both at the EPA level and at the state level. And so what we'll do is I will talk a little bit. I'll have the state, Jenny Newman from the Regional Water Quality Control Board, speak a little. And I've also invited a number of vested stakeholders that I thought was really valuable to have them talk about what they've done in this watershed. Improvements they've done, action on the ground. I think that's really valuable to hear. So I've invited a few folks to speak on that. Are there, at this point, I do want to ask, are there people who feel that they also want to spend a couple minutes talking before the beginning of the Q&A session? Obviously, you can think about that. When we are at the Q&A session, I'm happy for folks to kind of give you some time to speak about any specific items. Yes?
If you're introducing somebody, you say that you can call the panel. Could they sit down and just give us the background and justify the knowledge base, including yourself?
We can do that before we do this.
Yes, absolutely, and I will do that. I just wanted to... Sorry?
Repeat the question.
You wanted to make sure that whoever the speaker is describes their background, who they represent, what basis they have to be before you talk. So yes.
Time allotment, how much for presentation, how much for either Q&A or...
Yes, I'm going to get to that. So I'm going to get to, give me a few minutes and I will get to it. I'll also talk about myself. I want to make sure that we give a lot of time for Q&A, so I'm trying to limit our talking time for about 45 minutes. And then 45 minutes for Q&A session. My guess is I will be happy to stay around afterwards if people want to talk more or come up to me to talk. I'm happy to do that. I just want to make sure that we have also time for you guys to understand the different processes. Okay, so got that out of the way. I'll talk a little bit about myself. You know, it's very interesting that I'm here today. I wanted to mention that, again, I am representing US EPA, but I've actually been working in this watershed for over 15 years. I've actually at one point worked for the city of Malibu as a graduate student, collecting information and data for the city of Malibu. I've done research on both the lagoon and the creek and in Ventura County. I've worked with stakeholders in the Calabasas Creek watershed group, pretty extensively with them. And so I've actually spent a lot of time in this watershed. It's very important to me, which is actually why I volunteered to sign up for these projects. I think that it's a really unique watershed, really important watershed to try to get a lot of information out to folks and to the public. In terms of my background, I have a doctorate in environmental science and engineering. I have a master's in environmental chemistry. I have a bachelor's of science in biology and ecology specifically from UCLA. And so I've been working on the sciences, evaluation, assessment for most of my career, and a lot of that time from this watershed. Seems to me this watershed keeps calling me back, even though I've lived in San Francisco, I've lived in Asia, but every time I come back to California, I end up working on this watershed somehow. So I feel I have a connection with this watershed, so I'm very encouraged by the turnout tonight. So that's a little bit about me. I want to then spend time talking about the TMDL. Okay, so great. And like I said, what I'm going to go over is kind of the TMDL process, why EPA is working on a TMDL, what the information is about this TMDL. So first, why is EPA completing a TMDL? So I will talk a little bit about what a TMDL is, but first I did want to talk a little bit about why EPA is here today. One is we basically support the Clean Water Act. And in the Clean Water Act,
What's the Clean Water Act?
oh, we don't, not yet. Sorry?
Is that a law or passed or what?
Yes, the Clean Water Act. Clean Water Act is an environmental statute or law.
It's not, is it a law that is it set up by the public service sector or is it a law to the United States? It's passed by the federal government.
Do you mind if I at least get through half of this and then you hold your questions at home? I mean, I'm happy to talk, but I definitely want to make sure I get to some of my stuff, and then you can ask me some of the details. So, like I said, US EPA basically supports a federal law called the Clean Water Act. What the Clean Water Act says essentially is that our waters have to be fishable and swimmable. As part of that Clean Water Act, and I won't go into the regulatory details, or which is not that important for tonight, or interesting probably for folks. But if you do want to know the details, I'm happy to have a discussion with you afterwards. It requires that water is fishable and swimmable, like I said. The other thing it does require is that it requires that states, like California, must identify impaired waters or polluted water bodies. And that could be a lake, a stream, a beach, any water body. So the state of California, the regional board in this case, back in 1998 and subsequently in 2006 and 2008, basically identified these polluted waters and put it on this list. This list is called an impaired waters list. When a water body has been identified by the regional board, or the state in this case, to be impaired and placed on the list, what then needs to happen is you must complete what's called a TMDL. So that's a mouthful, full of a word, and let me just say TMDL is total maximum daily load. And what that basically means is it's just a detailed assessment of identifying pollutants, the sources of those pollutants, setting protective targets, setting protective targets, and really sets a blueprint for how to address these impairments. So that's the total maximum daily load. There are many elements of that. If you want to, again, please feel free to talk to me afterwards, or you can give me a call. You can also look up some of this information about TMDL, the elements of it on our website, EPA. Just Google TMDL, it will come up. So essentially that's what it is. It's a blueprint, an assessment of the data that basically confirms or doesn't confirm whether there is pollution or impairment in your water body. So coming back to Malibu Creek watershed, maybe go to the next slide. Why is it that we're trying to look at Malibu Creek watershed? Well, like I said, this watershed is placed on this impaired waters list. And so, since it was on this impaired waters list, then a TMDL, a total maximum daily load, has to be completed. So what does that mean about completing a TMDL? It means that basically EPA and the state completes a document This document describes all the available data to date, the comprehensive data to date that's available to us to review, to assess, to consider. And then we make a final determination about, or conclusions about what the problem is, what the sources of pollution are, and we set targets, because the goal of Clean Water Act, the goal of EPA is to protect the health of the water. And then the TMDL actually provides the basis in this roadmap for us. I think, so at this point, we can go to the next slide. Okay. So I have some pretty pictures here we're talking about. I did want to say that this TMDL covers both the lagoon and the Malibu Creek main stem and the tributaries that drain into it. And so the other thing I want to mention is that I mentioned to you what TMDL is. I mentioned to you that it's listed for a pollutant. The other thing I wanted to tell you is what is it identified as the problem? And the problem that's been identified is sedimentation and benthic macroinvertebrates, another mouthful word. And I'll explain a little bit what that is. But you might be familiar, for example, like copper as a pollutant, or toxicity, or metals, for example. In this case, the state had identified, based on data at the time, that sedimentation and benthic community condition is impaired. And so a TMDL is required.
Excuse me, you said the state of California did this?
Yes, the state of California. Yeah, the state of California identified it as a problem. And so that gets, and we approved it, sorry, and we did approve it. It is a very close relationship we have with the state. We help each other out. They identify it, we review the information, and we approve the list. Thank you, Jenny. The other thing that I should mention about it is that the benthic macroinvertebrates and the sedimentation listings are basically, like I said, identified as impairments. And so what we did, I remember now. What I wanted to actually get to is why EPA and the Region Board are actually working on this, and what is the EPA portion, and what is the state portion. So back in 1999, EPA was litigated by a number of nonprofit organizations. And under the Clean Water Act, once you have a water body that's on that impaired list I had talked about, you must complete a TMDL. Well, neither the state or EPA actually completed any of those TMDLs. And so because of that lawsuit, over 900, what's called pollutant water body, or 92 TMDLs had to be done for the LA region area, which covers this watershed. It was a lot of work to be done, so EPA worked with the state very closely on trying to make sure that we meet and complete those TMDLs in time. A final deadline was set by the judge, what's called a consent decree, that you must complete this number of TMDLs in this amount of time. So we are at the end of that, and the original deadline was March 24, 2013, and then they got extended because of concerns by the public, and we worked on trying to make sure that we have more responsive time to the public's comments. So EPA is working on the TMDL, but after that process, once the TMDL is completed, it does go to the state. The state actually then takes the TMDL and works on developing an implementation plan. And this part is a little bit, I think, can be very confusing of the distinction between the state and the EPA. But the EPA basically has to complete the technical portion of this TMDL. And so it has the authority to just do the assessment, the data assessment, the data evaluation, and then setting those protective targets. So that's why we're here today. That's why EPA is here today before you, to explain that process to you. So I do want to get back to the benthic macroinvertebrates to give you an understanding of the basis of this TMDL. Before I do that, sorry, there's a lot of things I want to cover tonight. I do want to say that the other thing that the state does is when it actually evaluates what's being impaired, it does look at what's being impacted. So there is such a thing called beneficial uses, and these are basically like what is important, why do we have this water body, what are the uses? So for example, it could be swimming, recreational use, it could be wildlife protection, aquatic life protection, etc. So in Malibu Creek watershed, we have about 23 beneficial uses, recreational wildlife, threatened and endangered habitat, aquatic species, the such. So the impairment that we had talked about was benthic macroinvertebrate and sedimentation. And I'll talk more about that, but along the way, they've been collecting data, they as in the state, and a whole number of different organizations have been collecting data. And here is a picture of the watershed, one of the, actually Malibu Creek, where you have a lot of algae coverage. And again, another one of algae coverage that we see. And so this has been ongoing in the watershed for a while and pretty extensively. Okay, so now I want to talk about benthic macroinvertebrates. So what are benthic macroinvertebrates? And why are they important? They're animals without backbone. You can see them with your naked eye. They're crayfish. They're usually the larvae of insects living in your or the stream bottom, or even sometimes in the water column. And basically, this is a larvae or nymph mayfly. Next slide. And this is an adult mayfly. But during the larval stage, when they're in a young, they will spend between months or up to 2 years in the stream habitat. And that's where they get all of their food. They basically also work on nutrient cycling. It's a really important part of the food web for the stream ecosystem. And I think more importantly, nationally, a lot of studies and scientific assessments and research has been done on macroinvertebrates, and they've been shown to be really good water quality indicators. So that is actually a reason why, when the state listed it, was based on data on these benthic macroinvertebrates and on water quality showing that there are impairments. That basically these particular critters, their habitat are being impacted, their numbers or their abundance are being impacted. We don't see as many of them. We don't see as many of what's called sensitive species that can't handle pollution as much. And so there's a lot of evaluation assessment of that.
Excuse me, will you take any questions?
I will, I think during the Q&A session, because I definitely want to make us get through a lot of this.
Do you know if mosquito fish will deplete the population of these larvae? Because we put mosquito fish everywhere in this area because of West Nile virus.
So I'm going to answer your question during the Q&A session, if you don't mind, just because I really want to make sure I get to all the other speakers too. But I'm happy to answer your question at the end, if you feel like you need more time. So, next slide. So some people have called, some scientists have called these benthic macroinvertebrates water canaries because they are good indicators of water quality and good indicators of ecosystem and stream health condition. Like I said, they're very critical to balancing the ecosystem process. They really get the energy flow in their food webs in the streams. And basically they process leaf litter. They're really important to nutrient cycling. They aerate the sediment so that you have enough oxygen level in the stream, riparian habitat. Those are all the things that these critters are really important for. And this is why there is a listing of benthic macroinvertebrates in the creek and also in the lagoon. Next slide. Okay, this is really small wording and text, so please don't feel like you have to look at the text. But all this is showing is it's a food web and ecosystem cycling, showing the connections between the benthic macroinvertebrates, the fish, because some of these benthic macroinvertebrates are a food source for the fish, basically the parasite, the microorganisms. It's a really complex system, but very important to ensuring that we have a really healthy stream and also lagoon. Next slide. So that's kind of the foundation of and the basis for doing this TMBL. And the next step that we did is we looked at all the data. So in the last year and a half, actually longer probably, 20 months or so, we started gathering the information. We actually were gathering information even before then. But I did want to share with you the amount of effort and the work that's been done in this watershed is very impressive. It just goes to show you how important this watershed is in so many different ways. We looked at water quality. We looked at, like I said, benthic macroinvertebrates. We looked at physical habitat measures, so that could be like your stream width, how much wood is along, how much tree coverage there is, so those kind of measures. We also looked at the sediment. So these are what we call multiple lines of evidence that we're looking at. We also evaluated, and I think this is an underestimation, but approximately 120 separate sets of data, reports, studies that covered between 1998 and 2011. And in fact, I probably didn't even mention all of the historical data before 1998. I'm just talking about the very specific data for those multiple lines of evidence that we looked at. But we covered a lot of ground. We really tried to be comprehensive at evaluating all the information. We also looked at that in this watershed there is a natural geologic formation, what's called the Monterey Modelo Formation. We looked at wildlife history in this watershed. We looked at land use change over time and also flow over time in this watershed. And history, we looked at climate, all of those things we actually looked and considered. And part of the reason why we have such a massive document. But the other thing we also did for this, because we know this is really important, we incorporated statewide approaches that are actually trying to develop biological objectives for the entire state of California. They're actually trying to look at nutrient numeric approaches for the state of California. So in those different statewide approaches, it's things like models, assessment methodology. We actually use those same methods and incorporate it here in this report because we want it to be comprehensive and evaluate all the available information. So we have reports from so many different sources. I just wanted to highlight a few to give you a sense. We have reports and studies from both local and state and some national scientific experts who've looked at this watershed and we consider their data. Sources from the National Park Service, from the California Department of Fish and Game, from the Southern California Coastal Water Research Program, which is a research institute in Southern California that works on many different research efforts.
One thing, if you have a picture of these conference, right? They're all public service agencies. Did you go out to a consultant company that actually goes on?
Yes, because
You mentioned it, that's why I asked.
yes. So there's just so many. Virgenes Municipal Water District. Some of these actually will contract out to consulting companies to complete these reports. LA County, UCLA, UC Santa Barbara, etc. I mean, there's just, I should say that this is not a comprehensive list. This is just highlighting a few of the reports that we've looked at in the study that's been done in this watershed. Next slide, please. So, the other thing I wanted to mention, like I said, we had multiple lines of evidence. We looked at a lot of different data. We then had to figure out, okay, what are the causes and stressors? So what we did, which is what both our U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA Office of Research and Development has recommended and basically come up with, which is what's called a causal assessment. The state actually is basically recommending highly that we basically use for any of these kind of efforts, whether it's a TMDL or an assessment, that you do what's called a causal assessment or what's called a stressor identification. And what that does, basically in a nutshell, is it looks at all the potential causes and stressors. And it really tries to figure out, okay, what is the evidence? For this group. So I have here a list of all, well, maybe not all, but most of the causes and stressors that we've considered and looked at. And so I wanted to highlight that for you here, that we looked at all of those stressors, all of those potential causes, and for each one of those, we looked at the evidence, the data. We looked at the data set, we considered how basically it supports, we analyzed the evidence, we analyzed the relationship. I'm going to come back to the slide, but can we go to the next slide? Okay, so this is a really small slide. I don't want you to necessarily read it, but what this is really showing you is that it is a complex system, and there are many potential causes of biological condition that's being impacted. And so when we did the causal assessment, we had to look at each one of these relationships, and we considered the evidence. So just as an example, this is sedimentation, which impacts habitat, but then we had to go back and look at the water quality. We had to go back and then look at channel alteration. We had to then go back and look at what does that do to. So we did that for all of those different stressors. Can you go return back? So I'm highlighting that because I think it's really critically important to know that when this effort, we actually did look at all of those. So this is the scientific part that we did. Then, basically, after that, for the TMDL purpose, we had to identify what are the pollutant stressors and what are the pollutants that we need to focus on. And that had the most amount of evidence and data that we evaluated that supported that there is an impact. And so the red highlight, sedimentation, nutrient enrichment, and alter hydrology, came out of our analysis as having the most critical impact in terms of identifying a pollutant. Now that's not to say that those other stressors are not playing a part in this watershed, because I think that they are, but there wasn't sufficient information or data to support it. And basically also sometimes it could be a small percentage, but not greater. For example, like if you had a pie, it would be a small sliver. Okay, so at this point, that's kind of, I know I went to a little bit of the nitty-gritty, but I really wanted you to understand kind of the scientific endeavor we actually did for this process and what we considered in this watershed. The next thing I wanted to talk about was that the process since then. So we completed that, and then because I know that this is so important for so many different organizations, I actually, for over a year, went quarterly to the Malibu Creek Watershed Malibu Creek Management Council meetings and provided updates to the group there. And these are basically representatives from your cities, from your water districts, from other different entities that have a stake in for the watershed. And quarterly, I would go to these meetings and give an update of, this is what we're doing now, this is what we're considering. And because I was able to do that, they have requested that, this is a lot, can you please give us more information? And we try to do as much as we can. You can imagine all the information we had to, go through and also then produce a report. But I felt it was really valuable and important. So I actually provided a pre-draft of the TMDL to this work group so that they can look at it and give me feedback and have an idea of what's going on, what it'll look like. Then in December, we basically put out our draft TMDL. Now I want to talk a little bit about the EPA process of a draft TMDL. And that is really important because for EPA, it's really important that we put out a draft document. The draft document is put out, it basically, when we put draft, it's a recognition that it's not perfect. That here's what we have to date. We value the public's opinion. We're putting it out because it's a transparent process. We also recognize that there are things that we might have missed, and it is our opportunity to get information from the local groups, from local entities, or the local, general public people who are interested in this, have reviewed it, or looked at it, and has questions. Because sometimes we miss things, in all of this. So we know that this is a really important part. And this process is probably the most important part for us, is the kind of putting out a draft document, getting the responses back, telling us, oh, you missed this, can you make this correction, or did you think about this? So since December until this point, today, that's the process we've been in. We've gotten many comment letters already. Our comment letter period ended in January. I had held another public workshop back in January describing the details of the TMDL. And since then, we've gotten a lot of information. I've talked to many different organizations about the TMDL, about what things we should look at, what considerations we should include, what modifications we need to do. And let me just repeat, it is a draft document, so usually the final will incorporate all of these concerns. And so I can't emphasize how important that process is for us, because it is our way to try to work with the stakeholders as we complete this process. So at this point, basically, once EPA completes it, and our extended deadline is May 23rd, then EPA completes a final TMDL. And once this final TMDL is completed, the regional board actually then looks at the TMDL, and that's when they develop an implementation plan. Can we go to the next slide? Okay. I think that's where I'm going to basically try to, in the interest of time, give Jenny Newman some time to talk about implementation. But, so what I described up to this point is really the process that EPA has undertaken. And once May 23rd hits, we will put out a final TMDL along with our extensive response to all the comments from the comment letters that some of you may have submitted to us. And so that's really important to know. It will be on our website. But I would say that the most important process is not necessarily even this TMDL process. The most important process is probably this post-EPA TMDL, because that's when the public gets to speak with the state, with the regional board, about implementation, about actions and milestones, and what it would mean, what is the on-the-ground work that needs to be done, that need to be incorporated. And that process will take time, because it is a discussion with the state. So, yes, real quickly.
You've taken 12 years to come up with this preliminary, whatever it is, and have you come to any conclusions? Can you identify any pollutants that are causing?
Yes, the pollutants we identified are nutrients and sedimentation.
That's the pollutant?
Mm-hmm. No, the focus on this particular team now is not on bacteria. The listing that I was talking about that identified benthic macroinvertebrates and sedimentation. And so,
what about the scientists that just restored the Malibu Creek to the benthic invertebrate habitat? Are now saying that.
so we're not in a Q&A session. I'm sorry, just because I just want to make sure we get to our, just real quickly, and then we can actually focus on having some more deep discussion, if you don't mind. So I want to give the mic to Jana Murphy, who's with the Regional Water Quality Control Board. I really please, we can hold your questions specifically about it.
I think what we'll do is after all of the invited speakers speak, Cindy can field questions, and I'll walk around with this microphone so everyone can hear the question and the answer. My presentation will be very quick. I'm going to give my background. My name is Jenny Newman. I'm an environmental scientist with the Los Angeles Regional Water Quality Control Board. We're a state agency, part of the California Environmental Protection Agency. I have a Bachelor of Science in Geochemistry from the University of California, San Diego, and a Master's in Environmental Science and Management from the University of California, Santa Barbara. I've been at the Los Angeles Regional Board since 2001, and I've been working in the Malibu Creek watershed for all of that time, on one project or another. I'm in the TMDL unit, so we're responsible for adopting and implementing TMDLs. And I've been in that unit since 2004. Okay, so you can just roll the ball. So to go over again how the US EPA and the state work together, I've just put a list of all of the agencies involved in water and wastewater. At the federal level, you have United States EPA, Office of Water. That's who Cindy works for. Actually, she works for Region 9 of EPA. Then you have the state, and you have Cal EPA is our umbrella agency, and then you have the state regional, or the state water quality control board, and then there's 9 regional water quality control boards in the state. So Cindy talked about EPA implements the Clean Water Act, which is a law adopted in 1972. And a lot of times EPA delegates authority for implementing the law to the states. And so the EPA has delegated implementation of the Clean Water Act to the state. And the state is supposed to write that list of impaired water bodies and then write TMDLs for water bodies on that list. But as Cindy explained, we're subject to a court-ordered consent decree, and so EPA and the state work together to develop that long list of TMDLs, and now we're reaching the end of that list. So then the local agencies involved are wastewater agencies such as the Las Virgenes Municipal Water District and the Triunfo JPA, thank you, the JPA. Stormwater agencies like LA County and Ventura County Watershed Protection District. So those will be the agencies that implement the TMDLs that EPA and/or the regional board adopt. So like I said, there's 9 regional boards, and we're here in Region 4. At the bottom of the state, we're Los Angeles and Ventura County. Okay, so EPA has developed a draft TMDL. It includes a plan, it allocates, so it defines the impairment, it identifies the causes of the impairment, and then it allocates load reductions in the pollutants causing the impairment to all of the responsible agencies in the watershed. Those include those wastewater agencies, the stormwater agencies, also other sources like agriculture and horse facilities, septic systems. So there's many sources of the pollutants that we've identified, or that EPA has identified in the watershed. And so what the regional board's job now is, because the EPA TMDL is just a technical TMDL, it doesn't have an implementation plan and it doesn't have a schedule. So I said sometimes the regional board adopts a TMDL and then EPA approves it, and sometimes EPA just adopts their own TMDL. So in this case, EPA has adopted, it's not their own, it's our TMDL, but without waiting for us to do it because we didn't have the time. So, but the EPA TMDL doesn't have a schedule. So what that means is, without the state adopting an implementation plan and a schedule, all of these sources would be responsible for complying immediately. And we would have no discussion of the way that they would comply. So that's where the implementation plan comes in. And the regional board is going to, once the EPA technical TMDL becomes final, we're going to begin work on developing an implementation plan. And so the implementation plan will include a schedule. It will include time for all of the different sources to come into compliance, based on how much time it will take and how urgently we need to clean up how to reduce the loading of the pollutants. It will include interim milestones, because if you have a long schedule, we want to make sure we're making progress. So there would be perhaps phased reduction in nutrient and sediment loading, or, and it would depend on the different type of source. The plan will also include a description of all of the mechanisms that will be, the regulatory mechanisms that will be used to implement the allotted amount of pollution to all the different sources. So we have a permitting authority at the regional board, and we issue permits to various sources of pollutants. And so those permits will contain the requirements that the TMDL identified, and will be the way that we can enforce and make sure that everyone's reducing the load. As part of the implementation plan development, there will be numerous opportunities for public input. We have workshops just like this in the development process, and also the implementation plan that the regional board will adopt is going to go before our regional board, and they'll have to vote on the staff's proposed recommendation. So staff will work with stakeholders and the public to come up with a plan, and then we'll put it out for public comment. And that's a 45-day period. Everyone can read the document, we'll meet with people, they can provide comments, we can work with stakeholders to come up with solutions to the different concerns. And then we present the item to our board and they vote. And you will also have another opportunity to speak before our board at that time. So that's the process that the regional board goes through for implementing a TMDL. I didn't bring my contact information, but if anyone has any questions, I'll be around after. And I'm sure, my contact information was on the public notice, so you can call me with any questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Jenny. I'm gonna basically, I think we have a number of additional, just real quick presentations. One is by David Pedersen with the Virgenes Municipal Water District, representing the Triunfo JPA. So David's just going to give a little bit of update about what's been done by the water district to this point.
Good evening. Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. My name is Dave Pedersen, and I'm the administrative agent and general manager of the Las Virgenes Triunfo Joint Powers Authority. And I wanted to thank you all for coming this evening. Also, before we got into things, I wanted to recognize a few folks here. There's a number of elected officials in the audience, and I thought it would be good could recognize them, if they could perhaps raise their hand. The reason I point that out is because I think this watershed is very unique, and the level of interest and engagement here is unique as well. And I think that it shows by the interest that we have here tonight. A little bit about me. I've met many of you, but I'm a new face probably to many of you as well. And that's because I am new to the Joint Powers Authority in Virgenes Municipal Water District. I started work here in January. My background is as a civil engineer. I'm a registered civil engineer in California. I've practiced engineering for just shy of 20 years now. My background is primarily in water quality, water chemistry, and water and wastewater treatment. So that's where most of my experience is. I have some experience with flood control and other public infrastructure. My career, I spent most of my career with LA County Department of Public Works, about 16 or 17 years. And then I went on to work for the Irvine Ranch Water District in Orange County. And then recently, of course, came here. But during my time with the county, I did a lot of work in this area. Most of my projects were here. And so I'm familiar with the watershed, and I'm also a quick study, and so I've done my best to get up to speed on the issues. So I'm going to be sharing with you this evening our perspective as one of the agencies, primary agencies that will be subject to the regulation. And so you'll see a little bit different perspective. And before I share that with you, I also wanted to recognize both Cindy and Jen, because they invited us to speak here, and I think that we appreciate that. It gives a balanced perspective to you. And also, I wanted to recognize them. We've been meeting with them for probably the past 8+ weeks. And we may not have had a meeting of the minds, probably we haven't, but it hasn't been due to a lack of trying. And we have tried hard, and I think at times had difficult conversations, but have both put in a diligent effort. So with that, I want to tell you a little bit about our agency. For those who are not familiar, we provide sanitation services to about 100,000 people. We're a combination of two public agencies, the Virgenes Municipal Water District, with a service area bounded here by the black line, and then the Triunfo Sanitation District on the other side of the county line, which is here in the red. And so together we're part of the Joint Powers Authority. It was formed in 1964, and so it's a partnership between our two agencies. We have a single wastewater treatment plant, and it's down here. It's called the Tapia Water Reclamation Facility. And the 101 corridor is here, just to orient you. And then what we have here is the outline of the Malibu Creek watershed. So you can see that our Joint Powers Authority boundary roughly mirrors the watershed boundary. And in the sanitation business, that makes sense. And so the watershed is an important issue to us. We have a 10-member elected board, so there's 5 board members from each of the two agencies. And one of our central values in our agency is environmental stewardship. And this is a reflection of what the customers expect of us, and also the watershed in which we work. A couple accomplishments that I think are worth going over and mentioning for the Joint Powers Authority. The Joint Powers Authority is a pioneer in water recycling. One of the first agencies and early agencies in California to start recycling water in 1972. Currently, 60% of our wastewater flow in this area is reused in the community. It's reused in parks, green belts, schools, and open space. And then during the summertime, that increases to 100%. During the winter time, it's less because we have more recycled water than there is demand for. Composting. The Joint Powers Authority has shown leadership with its composting operation. We have a composting facility. It was a $50 million facility. It's been in operation since 1994. And what we do is we take the solids that are generated from the wastewater treatment process, and rather than land applying it like was done historically and many other agencies continue to do, we produce a compost that can be used by the community, and every Saturday folks can come and pick it up and use it in their gardens. nutrient reduction. We've, for many, many years now, probably 2 decades, the Joint Powers Authority, through improvements of its treatment plant and its solids handling facility, have invested in reducing nutrients. Probably $11 million, maybe even more, in those 2 decades to reduce nutrients in the creek and in the watershed. And part of that was to meet a nutrient TMDL that was in 2003 adopted. And then finally, creek avoidance. We discharge recycled water, and we have here 2 bottles just to show. One is untreated wastewater, and one is Title 22 recycled water, the product. So during certain times of the year, we do discharge recycled water to the creek, to Malibu Creek. But for most of the year, 7 months of the year, we discharge no water to the creek. And that's from April 15th until November 15th. The only time we discharge during those periods is when we need to support the fish, the steelhead. And that's only when there's very, very low flows in the creek and then the water is needed for the fish. And we've invested, on average, about $600,000 a year to do that. It varies from year to year. So when we talk about this TMDL and the proposed TMDL, that's what it is. It's proposed still. It hasn't been established or adopted yet. We have a number of concerns. And we'd like to go over those with you. There's 5 concerns total, and I'm going to cover each one. I want to summarize them first, and I'll have a slide for each. One is that this TMDL has provided inadequate evidence that it's going to reduce algae in the creek and the tributaries to the creek. This TMDL is about algae. The natural characteristics and the uniqueness of Malibu Creek watershed have been largely dismissed in the analysis here. The TMDL is being rushed to meet an arbitrary deadline that was established by a consent decree as a result of a lawsuit that you heard about, at the expense of scientific rigor and stakeholder input. And you heard about a workshop in January. I'd like to ask how many people knew about the workshop in January and how many people were there? I think a handful. The reason was it was in downtown LA at 600 South Wilshire, where it's $18 to park, where you have to fight traffic to get there. And so that's the reason why nobody was there. And we're very thankful to have this workshop today because we think this is important and that you need to know about it. Number 4, there's an existing TMDL. It was established in 2003. It's for nutrients, and it has not been fully implemented. And number 5, and perhaps most important, is the cost of compliance for this regulation is enormous. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. $307 million in capital cost and $23.5 million annually every year for operation and maintenance. Now there's certain assumptions made there, and those assumptions are that this TMDL would be established as it's been published, and that it would be applied to our discharges to the creek, as in end-of-pipe discharge. So I'm going to go through just briefly each of these points, and you'll see the number to match the previous slide. So number 1, the inadequate evidence. And so what we have here is a connection, or a linkage as it's called in these TMDLs. And you'll see there's 3 shapes there. On the left, there's nutrients, which are really what we're talking about is nitrogen and phosphorus. Those are the 2 primary nutrients. Those are being linked to algae in the center. This is about algae. Primarily, the entire issue we're going to be talking about is algae, okay? And then on the right is benthic macroinvertebrates, which are the aquatic insects that live in the creek. And so there's a connection made between each of those, that the nutrients are causing and supporting algal growth, and that the algal growth is impairing the benthic organisms. I will tell you that in this TMDL, there's no positive correlation shown whatsoever between nutrient levels and algal cover. In fact, the TMDL, if you look at it, if you have it, and if you're a note taker like I am, specifically shows that there is no correlation between those 2. And if you look, and I'll reference page 8-36, than H8-37. And if you look, and you can look on the website, you'll see that it clearly states that there is no correlation. There's no evidence provided that algal growth can be controlled by limiting nutrients. And that's really what this TMDL is intending to do, to essentially starve the algae, which use the nutrients as a food source. And finally, there's as much algae upstream of the Tapia discharge, our discharge for our wastewater treatment plant, as there is downstream. And a lot of the focus of this TMDL is on our discharge of our wastewater treatment plant and the nutrients that are discharged, and there are nutrients. But I would ask, why is there the same amount of algae upstream and downstream? And so each of you might have the same question. I show these little X's here because we don't believe that these linkages are appropriate. We don't believe there's evidence to support it. So the question comes, what is causing the algae growth? And I think we don't have to look far. We look to a local project that the city of Calabasas has completed. It's a project on Virgenes Creek at Agura Road. It's not far from our office. It's a project that I think this watershed should be really proud of. I know that the city is. And what you see in the upper left is you see the pre-construction condition of the creek. And you can see extensive algae. And there's algae coverage all over it. It's a concrete lined flood control channel, which is fairly common. We have lots of flood control channels like this. It's a trapezoidal channel. There's very little vegetation growth around it because it's concrete. The city, through its leadership, developed a project and received grant funding and completely reconstructed that portion of the channel, removed all of the armament, and planted it. And this picture, I took this picture today myself from, as best I could, the same vantage point as the previous picture. And you can't even see the creek. The vegetation has grown in so, it's thrived so much that you can no longer even see the creek. So I hiked down in there, and there's a nice pathway, if you're familiar with the site. There's a pathway down in there in sort of a park-like area. And I took a picture of the creek. And you can see here the dense canopy. We've got a nice tree canopy over the top, and you've got shade. And so there's very little sunlight penetrating in there. And what you'll find is there's also very little algae. There is some algae left. There's algae there. But I'll tell you, it's certainly not like it was before. So one of our key beliefs is that sunlight availability is key to algae growth. The other is water current. So you'll notice here too, there's a narrowing of this stream. This stream up here is very wide. And so the water is moving very slowly. And algae can flourish in that kind of environment. When the water is moving quickly, the algae has more difficulty thriving. Here you have a narrow creek. As you brought this armament back, you have a narrow creek and faster flowing water. And that's another contributing factor. And what's interesting is, when you look at the TMDL document, you'll find that it says this very thing in there. And it says it on page 8-33, if you look at it. And I would encourage you to look at it. Point number two, and I'll try to keep moving. I know this is a long night. Unique characteristics of our watershed. One of the most unique characteristics of our watershed is the geology. The geology here, we have the Monterey Formation. You heard some talk about it. It's California's primary petroleum source rock. It's a marine sedimentary shale. Geology is really important in its influence to water quality. So the purple area here is the Monterey Formation, the shale. Okay? This indicates the geology. The red area is a different geology. Each different color represents different geology. So you have Malibu, you have the main stem of Malibu Creek down here, and up here the upper watershed across Virgenes Creek. And so what you'll see is all of the upper watershed primarily drains from the Monterey Formation, and that's really important. The Monterey Formation contributes significantly to salt levels in the creek. We have a brackish creek. This is not a freshwater creek. And And that's really important because we want to look at the critters and the benthic organisms that we look for and that we find in the creek are those that thrive in a brackish creek, not a freshwater creek. And that's not surprising. We have TDS levels. TDS is a measure that's commonly used to measure salt content. It's called total dissolved solids. The TDS levels in our creek, in Malibu Creek, range from 1,000 to 2,000 parts per million. And for comparison, drinking water is generally in the range of 500 parts per million. So what we're talking about is 2 to 4 times as salty as drinking water. And that has an impact on the aquatic life. And so what I have here is a picture of the headwaters of Las Virgenes Creek. And this picture is taken above any developed area. It's taken from Las Virgenes Creek, kind of near the county boundary where the Amundsen Ranch project was proposed, which is now an open space area. And that's me in the picture, and it wasn't a good way to block me out. But what you see there is you see the white. The white there is salt. That's all salt. And if you go there, and you can pick that salt up, and it's crystalline, and it's covering the ground. And I'll tell you, that salt is not from human activity. There is no human activity above that area. So if we look at a pie chart, and I know Cindy mentioned a pie chart in the context of stressors, and it's interesting because we look at it that way too. Because there's a pie chart. This is a complex issue. There's many different stressors here. So in the center, what we have is what we call core IBI scores, which is sort of an index that's used to measure the health of the aquatic insects in the creek. And so when you look at the pie and the arrows pointing into it are all the different things affecting it, the stressors. And so what the EPA has looked at is unnatural nutrients, which are nutrients from the Tapia reclamation facility and also from fertilizer from urban runoff causing algae growth and excessive algae growth. Well, this pie is much bigger than what we've seen there. There's many other factors. These factors here, all of these factors that you see in red are factors that are contributed by the Monterey Formation. Natural factors that are causing impairments of the aquatic life in the creek. And it has largely been dismissed. And if you look here, there's other stressors. These stressors are also affecting the aquatic life. Invasive species, vector control, I heard somebody mention that. The fact that we don't have a perennial stream, and I'll talk about that more. Our stream, a perennial stream is one that flows constantly. Okay, our stream does not have constant flow. There's times of the year where portions of our creek dry up. It's not a perennial stream. And the indices that are being used in this TMDL are for perennial streams. And the reason that's important is because when the creek dries up, you can imagine it has a big impact on the aquatic organisms. They don't do well when it dries up. And this picture demonstrates it. This is a picture from Sarah Retreat, looking upstream from the Cross Creek Road Bridge. And what you see on the left is you see the water, and you see a lot of algae, which you see everywhere in this creek. And those of you who've lived here for a long time know that. And on the right, you see it's dry. It's completely dry. There's not a lot of aquatic insects thriving there. Okay, and then you see a pond. And that pond is slowly evaporating, and then the salts are left behind. Again, not a good condition for the aquatic insects. So number 3, this TMDL is being rushed. And the reason it's being rushed is...
Let him talk. Let him talk.
The reason... Thank you. And I'll try to make it quick. I know time is precious, but this is important. I really think it is. And, this is being rushed. This is a regulation that's being rushed. And I'll tell you, this regulation, this 303D listing, which it's called, it was approved by the state in June of 2010. And when the state did that, and the state does this always in their listings, they established a proposed date to establish a TMDL. And the proposed date I've shown right here, right from their document, was the year 2021. And that's a long time. That's not now. And the reason for that is this is a very complex issue, a very complex TMDL for which science has not reached the stage where it can support it. What's interesting is in September of 2010, the consent decree that you've heard about, which was originally signed and adopted and stipulated in 2010, was modified. And it was modified to change some of those pairings or TMDLs that were included, and there were a whole slew of them. Some of them were removed and some were added. This happened to be one that was added. So it was not part of the original effort. It was added in 2010. Interestingly, it took until the next year for the EPA to actually approve the listing, which is odd because normally a listing is approved before you begin to make plans to establish a TMDL. And then in December 12th of last year, the draft TMDL was released by the EPA, and that's the document that we have to look at. And you know, we should point out too, when we talk about the state and the state's effort here, you know, this effort's being driven primarily by the federal EPA. The state has been working on some really good policies and some good efforts that would support this. But unfortunately, what's happening here is the EPA is preempting that effort. And they will say that they're incorporating that effort, which I find interesting because that effort has not been completed. And that effort is still underway, and we're participating in that. And that is to develop policies for nutrients and biological objectives, which is the very thing that we're talking about here. So, number 4, there's an existing TMDL. It's an existing TMDL for nutrients, which sounds familiar. It was established in 2003. It was intended to reduce algae in our creeks. And since that time, we've seen little improvement in algae. And so again, we ask why. One, that TMDL, although it's been 10 years, has not been fully implemented. We've taken measures to comply with it, and we comply with it completely. The problem is, as the implementation process proceeds, it takes time. It hasn't been applied to all agencies that are permittees. It just recently, last year in November, was applied to the stormwater discharges. And they're taking an earnest effort now using a watershed-wide approach to address that issue. But those measures have not been put in place. Also, there's natural background levels of nutrients, and those are supporting algae growth. And so finally, we talk about the cost of compliance. And like I said, there's assumptions that are inherent in these. There is uncertainty inherent in these, but we've hired one of the best consultants in wastewater treatment to give us the best numbers that they could, assuming that we are to comply with these requirements as an end-of-pipe discharge. We previously had done a study like this because this TMDL, interestingly, in almost the same fashion was proposed previously in 2005. It was 160 million. The treatment technology is what's called reverse osmosis, which is, most people are familiar with for drinking water, desalting drinking water. It's not used for wastewater. In 2013, we've updated our estimate. The estimated cost is $307 million. Annual O&M cost hasn't changed a lot. Originally in 2005 it was 22 million, and now it's 23.5 million. So each of you are probably asking, what does this mean? What are the implications as a customer? And we're worried about that. That's a big issue. The cost is staggering. So if we were to finance this as a pay-go, in other words, all at once, in 1 year, it would be $8,150 per customer. Now, we don't normally finance projects that way, so that number is a little bit deceiving. Normally, a project like this would need to be bond funded, and so we would finance it over a period of 30 years. And so we ran those numbers too. And essentially what it would do is almost triple the cost of wastewater services. And then for that money, what we get is what we call a brine concentrator. We don't have the means to deal with brine here. We don't have a brine line, we don't have an ocean outfall. So we have 2 ways to get salt out of our watershed. One is by truck, and it's not a very good option because we don't need 100 trucks a day or more, whatever it is, I'm not sure what the number is. running salty water out of our watershed. The other means is to concentrate it, which is called the zero liquid waste discharge. It's essentially we crystallize the salt, remove all the water, and so that tower here is what is the infrastructure that's needed to do that. It looks to me like it would be more appropriate than an oil refinery. So proposed next steps. What we believe is that the complete science is necessary before acting on this TMDL. We don't feel like it's been done. We propose to support additional studies that are needed to close the data gaps, and there's many data gaps, although there's been a lot of study done, and improve the scientific understanding here. This is complex, and we need to understand what's going on. Continue to work with the EPA and the Regional Water Quality Control Board. Pursue opportunities to increase demand for recycled water, and we're working on that. Seek support and funding for seasonal storage of recycled water, and keep our customers informed of the progress. And what we believe is right is to advocate a watershed-wide management approach, which is very similar to what all the municipalities, the cities here are working on in complying with their stormwater discharge. In fact, I think they just received proposals today to prepare a watershed-wide approach to address a whole series of TMDLs. Rather than handling one pollutant and one impairment, one at a time, when we're not even sure that it's going to be right. So what can you do? Being here is a great first step, being engaged in the process, and encourage your neighbors to do the same. Participate in the watershed group meetings. So there's a core group of people who are always there. We need to get the people who are not there, the people who have not participated in the process, to weigh in and give their opinion. Sign up for a tour of the watershed and your wastewater facilities. We offer those tours. We've just started our watershed tours, and we encourage you to take advantage of that. Visit our websites, LVMWD.com and Triunfo Sanitation.com. We have a whole wealth of information on this issue. And then finally, make your voice heard. Write to your state and federal elected officials. They want to know. They want to know what you think about this. They want to know your thoughts, your ideas, your concerns. And so use that resource. And we've given you the addresses for all of them. We've talked to each of them. And we would encourage you to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. We have 3 more speakers after us. I think we have indication from both, let me just name the folks. It would be from Gilda Bay, the Ventura County, and also the LA County. So I think we'll start with Catherine Pease from Gilda Bay.
Okay, hi, good evening. My name is Catherine Pease, and I'm the watershed scientist at Gilda Bay. My background is in biology and ecology, and I have a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology from UCLA. As probably a lot of you know, Gilda Bay has been really involved in the watershed, as well as water quality issues in the area. We've been working in the Malibu Creek watershed since 1998. And we do both monthly monitoring of water quality as well as yearly monitoring of the bugs, the benthic macroinvertebrates. We definitely see a problem with the macroinvertebrates leading to this impairment that Cindy talked about. Many of our streams have really poor communities, poor biological communities. And then we also do see sites that have good communities. So there is the possibility in the watershed that we do, have these areas that have really great biological communities, and we think that even some of the areas that are degraded could become improved and reach some of those better sites. Just to kind of give you guys an overview also of benthic macroinvertebrates, I know Cindy talked about them, but they're really important because they give a really great indicator for water quality. They live in the water, they're surrounded by it completely, so if you kind of want to use them as an indicator species, it's really great for human health, as well as just sort of getting an overview of the whole picture of the water quality. So both chemistry, the habitat, so kind of like what's going on in the stream, as well as the whole stream health. So if you have an impaired benthic community, impaired biological community, you should be worried about that. There's many spots in the watershed that I said have really poor communities. So we're really supportive of EPA's effort, as well as the state's effort to improve the biological communities in the watershed. And we're definitely interested in seeing a lot of these streams have better communities.
Question for you?
So, can you just wait till the end? Sorry. So, we also, there's the linkage that was talked about between nutrients, algae, and benthic macroinvertebrates. There's many scientific studies that show linkages between those. And Cindy, I think the TMDL has really looked at a lot of sources for impairment of these communities. So it's not like it was just looked at nutrients. Like she said, there were many things they looked at. And there are clear, and many scientific studies that are peer-reviewed throughout the literature that show clear links between high nutrients and high algal cover. That's clear. Of course, sunlight is important, like David was saying. However, you still have to have the nutrients there to actually have the algae to grow. Like, you think of nutrients, they're important for things to grow. We need them to grow, to live, so does algae. So when you have high nutrients, you have high algal levels. And then those algal levels can really impair the structure of the stream. So if they just blanket the area, bugs can't live there. They have really poor environment for them. So that's sort of, some of the linkages, and there's many scientific studies that show those clear linkages, and that was relied upon a lot in the TMDL to show evidence for that. So I think there's clear evidence for those linkages, as well as at Heal the Bay, we monitor the bugs throughout the streams. We also monitor the nutrients, and we find high levels of nutrients, and we find high levels of algae in many spots. However, we do have some reference sites where we find really low levels of nutrients, particularly nitrate that was talked about, and those are also in some of those spots that we look at are in the Model Elementary Formation. So, I think we can't just say that it's, and I guess I should also say that some of those sites where we see good bug communities are also in sites. We have some reference sites that are outside the watershed. We also have reference sites that are inside the watershed in the Monterey and Modelo Formation, and those were used in the TMDL, and those also show pretty good bug communities. So we definitely think that algae is a huge problem, and that the way to deal with that is through nutrients. And let's see, what else do I want to say? I guess another thing is probably some of you are at our recent meeting about our report that we just put out on the state of the watershed, the state of the Malibu Creek watershed. So we kind of there assessed a lot of the problems that we see in the watershed, as well as offered some recommendations for how we could improve the health of the watershed and water quality. And we definitely, I think in this TMDL also, I don't think Tapia wastewater treatment plant is being singled out. I think it's clear that there's other sources of nutrients in the watershed. I think that needs to probably be acknowledged and talked about. Things like urban runoff, stormwater runoff from many of the cities, because it's true, we don't just see high algae below Tapia, we see it above and below Tapia. We see it in a lot of areas that are developed, and we see a lot of poor biological communities in areas that are really developed in terms of urbanization, like around the 101. So there's obviously, we acknowledge there's many different sources of nutrients as well as sediment coming into the watershed. So I think it's important to acknowledge that and not realize that the TMDL is not just picking out the inputs from the Tapia wastewater treatment plant. So I think that kind of gets back to, when we talk about these benthic or bug communities that are really impaired, that we need to address inputs of these nutrients and sediment, and a lot of that comes from, thinking about the implementation plan, which isn't even out yet. And so I think we should kind of get a lot of input into that, everyone should, and think about other ways that we can also reduce the impacts. And it could be on a personal level, in terms of using fertilizer on your lawn, that will help reduce the nutrient inputs to the creeks, and as well as thinking about low-impact development, so where any rainwater or water that falls can be captured and or reused and doesn't make its way down to the creeks. So I think there's many different ways that we could go about thinking about how we can improve the biological community in the streams. That's
They can have Evelina from the Ventura County. Thank you. Evelina Mutkowska, and I'm with the County of Ventura. I'm originally from Poland, that's where the accent is from. I have a master's in environmental engineering and bachelor in environmental chemistry. And I've been with the Ventura County for almost 4 years. I'm a stormwater program manager. I manage implementation of the state municipal stormwater permit and total maximum daily loads. County of Ventura was named as responsible party in 16 TMDLs countywide, plus 2 currently under development by EPA. Specifically in Malibu Creek, our county was assigned waste load allocations and load allocations to address water impairments caused by elevated levels of bacteria, nutrients, trash, and currently under development sediment and benthic microinvertebrate. To meet requirements of the TMDL's implementation schedules, County of Ventura and City of Thousand Oaks, we cooperatively worked on implementing activities required by the TMDL. We submitted monitoring as required monitoring plans, implementation plans. We conduct weekly bacteria monitoring at 7 sites within our jurisdiction, within Malibu Creek watershed, to satisfy the requirements of bacteria TMDL. Also, monthly, we monitor trash levels within our jurisdictions in Malibu Creek. This summer, we are planning to do a special study to identify the sources of bacteria to help us focus our efforts on implementation and effective treatment. And to address water quality impairments and TMDL requirements, our county has taken on planning and design of stormwater and urban runoff treatment systems in the county's right-of-way within the watershed. As the funding is almost non-existent, we focus on reaching out for the state funding opportunities. We've installed in 2010 5 water filtration units within the Oak Park area, residential area, to treat the street runoff prior to discharge into the creek and the storm drain system. This was designed as a pilot study. It appeared to be effective, however, the cost was prohibitive from the full-scale implementation. So we designed a concept project for more cost-effective treatment and applied for the state funding, Proposition 84, in 2012. Our project was not selected, however, we continue improvement of our design and planning on applying for another grant later this year. In the meantime, we also applied for the state urban greening grant to design and install bioswales, permeable gutters, and rain gardens curb extensions near Brookside School, and we are awaiting a state decision on selection of our funding. In addition to our efforts searching for funding opportunities to install stormwater treatment projects and devices, we've been implementing a number of best management practices that are required under our state permit. For example, we maintain stormwater hotline, we conduct stormwater inspections at commercial businesses, restaurants, gas stations, construction sites. In addition to street sweeping in Oak Park twice a month, there are ongoing channel and storm drain inspections and maintenance activities. For new development and redevelopment, our new state permit requires installation of post-construction best management practices to eliminate and treat stormwater runoff from new development and redevelopment projects. Also, during construction activities, we are required to implement a series of best management practices to reduce erosion and ensure sediment control. The County Environmental Health Division implements inspection program for the on-site wastewater treatment system,
And our regional program, County of Ventura, 10 cities in Ventura County, and Watershed Protection District also works together on very comprehensive and bilingual education and outreach. We have Facebook recently updated and released website with information on stormwater pollution prevention. We have a number of events, brochures, and educational materials. We also participate in monthly Watershed Council management meetings to share our efforts and regulatory information with the LA County and the cities within the LA County within the Malibu Creek watershed. Thank you so much.
One last speaker from LA County, Bruce, thank you.
Good evening, my name is Bruce Hamamoto. I'm a civil engineer with the LA County Department of Public Works. I've been with the county for 20 years now, and work primarily with drainage and land development, and most recently in stormwater quality. I'm representing the LA County and the LA County Flood Control District tonight. And the LA County has jurisdiction over, well, roughly over half of the Malibu Creek watershed, but less than 10% of that area is developed. For the Flood Control District, we maintain dams and flood control channels, storm drains, and catch basins throughout the LA County. In your area, we might be familiar with the Mtns Creek channel, the Las Virgenes Creek channel that was shown earlier. Was one of our facilities. We participated in that restoration, reclaiming the land over to the city of Calabasas for that project. The Flood Control District and the County of Los Angeles echo the concerns that were raised by Las Virgenes earlier and the County of Ventura. We have submitted comments to the EPA on the subject TMDL. I'd like to just reiterate a few of our key concerns tonight. The health of the Malibu Creek watershed, microinvertebrates, and fish community is relatively weak, or maybe poor in comparison to other parts of the nation or the region even, but those might be what the natural conditions for the Malibu Creek watershed are. Effects of wildfires and invasive species should not be downplayed. Those can have mitigating effects on the macroinvertebrates. The New Zealand mud snail being the most prominent one in current events. Naturally occurring nutrients from the Monterey Formation already register exceedances of the proposed nutrient levels. And even if all the anthropogenic sources of the nutrients are removed, there may still be little benefit to the overall health of the Malibu Creek watershed. There's not a clear linkage between the naturally occurring sediment and the biological health of the Malibu Creek watershed. Our concern is that if we interfere with the natural sediment cycle, it may result in other unintended consequences. At any rate, developments have more paved surface and contribute less sediment than most natural areas, which are subject to erosion. And finally, the State Board is developing a statewide biological objective policy, and which should be done in about a year. And we propose why not make the subject TMDL an interim one until the state's policy is adopted, at which time a more consistent approach could be implemented. Thank you.
To all our speakers, now we can begin our Q&A session. Yes?
Hello, I'm Dennis Washburn. I'm president of the Resource Conservation District in the Santa Monica Mountains, and also chairman for the past 20 years or so of the Malibu Creek Watershed Council, which has gone through a number of iterations along the way, but is still quite vibrant. And my question to all the speakers, and I hope that you will all address it, is what is the plan? And I can describe that. I wrote the letter as president of the RCD in 1990, May, to the state conservationist, Pearlie Reed, in the state of California and asked them to help us do a Malibu Creek watershed natural resources plan. And many of the folks in this room have actually contributed to that very thing, including all of you, because you're working on a very complex issue. It is so complex, in fact, that if we all worked for the next 20 years, we'd still be working to try to achieve the goals. But the goals that were set in this plan, and also the companion plan, which was part of the NEP project, the National Estuaries Program, that was then the San Monica Bay Restoration Project, and is now actually part of an ongoing commission's activities. I'm a member of that board as well. So working with the folks who wanted to save San Monica Bay, and all those folks who wanted to make this watershed work very well. And we've done so many things over the past 20 years or so. There's a list of 282 projects that we've identified. And these are the things that are part of a plan. So for the next 25 years, what are we going to do to achieve watershed health and enhance the watershed management planning and the achievement of those plans in this watershed? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I think that's an excellent question about the plan. Thank you for providing all the information you have just listed about the different projects and the long-term planning that's been taken up by other folks. And I think that actually one of the things I would like for this workshop to do is to talk a little bit about the future of the watershed and what the plan is. And I think that is a very constructive and positive thing to do, is to talk about what it is that needs to be done to address all the different sources in the watershed that's been identified. And so I agree with you that that's something that needs to be done, and it definitely needs to include all the members of the watershed, the different stakeholders.
Can I add to Cindy's answer? Okay. The EPA TMDL has the number and it identifies all the sources, and then the regional board implementation plan that we're going to be developing will spell out the plan and the length of time that each of the sources needs to achieve those numbers. And so there's point sources like the wastewater treatment plant, the stormwater folks who you heard talk today, then there's non-point sources. And a lot of the non-point sources were identified in the Malibu watershed management plan. And so we will be looking to that to describe for the implementation plan for the TMDL, to describe the kind of actions that the different sources will need to take to come into compliance with the number.
So I have a public records request email that was obtained. It was from Cindy Lynn in November 30th of 2012, and it was to Rich, Ambrose, Mark Gold, and Shelley Luce. As you know from our discussion last, it's hard to come up with targets or numeric goals for the Malibu Lagoon and benthic community, given we don't have real baseline data and also no data from the reference site. But at the end of the day, we still need to include some goal. Here's my idea. Do a survey of all the relevant California coastal estuaries and see the species richness. My thinking is that when Malibu Lagoon is restored and continues to improve, it is reasonable to expect greater richness. Instead of quibbling about the unknowns, which is the taxa and the X and Y and everything else that she goes into, it seems clear evidence that we have to have a decent benthic community. The final goal or target would be to achieve an X number of total taxa richness. The email goes on and on. Ask Rich to go and look and survey all of the other estuaries. We are citizens that fought that reconstruction of the Malibu Lagoon because we knew that there was no baseline data. And we would like to know, as citizens, where is the baseline data for the rest of the watershed for this benthic community? that is clear that can't live there when the entire watershed is too salty, has too much selenium, has too much magnesium. It just has too much of so many different things that's not being acknowledged. We know that Heal the Bay is the one that sued the EPA to come up with the TMDL targets that Heal the Bay wants to implement on these municipalities that cannot comply. It's going to cost the ratepayers a fortune. And the new science, the most available, best available science is not being listened to. The most up-to-date scientists are not being acknowledged, and the citizens have just been shoved aside and called obstructionists when we start to ask many of these questions.
Yes, let me answer you. You're asking about baseline data for this watershed. There actually are reference data, pretty extensive reference data that we looked at for this watershed, both in the very different tributaries, upstream of Monterey Formation, downstream of the Modelo Monterey Formation, in La Chusa, in Cheeseboro, and many different places. We've actually looked at pretty extensive reference information. And that information is what leads us to believe that this watershed is impaired. We've looked at the different relationships. We looked at the extent of the reference information. We've done an extensive analysis of the land use cover. We also looked at the Monterey Modelo Formation as a cause. The thing that has really come out of the scientific analysis, where we've done pretty intensive evaluation of the different relationships, is that there is a problem with development areas. We found really good, actually, biological condition scores for the benthic macroinvertebrates in Monterey Modelo Formation. And that leads us to believe that in those areas, they can survive and have a good condition and good index, that biological condition that we're talking about. And in fact, this Monterey Modelo Formation is critical for this watershed. It is not just Malibu Creek watershed that has the Monterey Modelo Formation. It actually is all along Southern California. The other thing we did also looked at basically is also looking at if there is, we can tease out what the issue is. And what we see basically is that these geologic formations have been here for millennia, that basically perhaps some of these benthic macroinvertebrates has developed and adapted to them. So because we found in these reference sites, and this is the baseline information you're talking about, that we have seen good benthic macroinvertebrate condition and also good water quality. So that is what leads us to this result and finding. That was for Malibu Lagoon, and actually for Malibu Lagoon, the data that we did have showed poor scores. What I was referring to is basically data from 30 years ago. What we did actually is in fact looked at all the different lagoonal estuarine systems in Southern California that are very much like Malibu Lagoon, and we looked.
The most current science and scientists will tell you that there is no other watershed in the state of California, JPA can back this up. Malibu watershed is the most unique watershed in the entire state of California because of its high salinity. But that's not being acknowledged, and I want to know why.
We did acknowledge that actually in the TMDL. We talked about the high conductivity and the high salinity.
How come the TMDL you don't recognize national standard? Excuse me.
Yes, we're going to move on to the next, just to give everybody a chance to talk.
Hello. Hi.
Yes.
My name is Fred Gaines. I'm the mayor of the city of Calabasas. I just want to say that we have share similar concerns that were raised today by the local agencies, Mr. Pedersen and the other local agencies. One of the linkages in my mind is between orders that come down from state and federal agencies and the practicality of having to do that and the cost of having to do that. And you separate those tasks. This is exactly the kind of problem that you end up having, and we think this is a classic example of that. In the city of Calabasas, one of the projects was highlighted, the watershed restoration, or the complete restoration that we did, we think that and watershed management plan procedure is a better way to go. And so we just wanted to be on record that we support those concerns. Thank you.
Thank you, and I just want to respond that we very much understand the concern of cost. We have identified where we are certain and where we are uncertain. And on your issue of implementation, we are also very concerned, which is why we have worked with the regional board. The thing that we've included in this period from the draft handbook, because we wanted to have on record basically your concerns so that we can move forward on some of our additional findings from the implementation side. For example, what we've decided to do is to include phased approach in the TMDL so that it can give folks time to address some of these, and that is going to be incorporated in the final TMDL, and so we recognize the concern and we will be addressing that.
My name is Michael Omari. I'm a local for the past 40 years.
Can't hear you.
I'm a local contractor for the past 33 years. Since 1980, I've been working in with these cities and development, and I know the history of the watershed. I lived up Malibu Creek, up Las Virgenes since 1980, in the 80s. One of my friends, Bob Miller, who was an engineering consultant for the U.S. Corps of Engineers, and he was a consulting engineer on the establishment of the Tapia Water Treatment Center. That was in 1980 when the population that treatment center only served perhaps 5% of the now's population, the present population of 100,000. He took me for a ride and showed me the plan between Lost Hills Road, where it joins Las Virgenes, and Mulholland, and the old Bob Hole Branch, in these open fields to the left and the right of Las Virgenes roads. Those are injection fields for the solid waste that comes out of the Tapia Treatment Center. Those fields, not anymore, but those fields were used for at least 20, 30 years, and they were filled to capacity. Let me tell you how. During the heavy rain in 2005, 2006, when we had the El Nino rain, I witnessed excuse the impression, the shit bubbles out of the ground from these injection wells, or perhaps the pressure pipes that are pushing that waste into the wells. That water is right along the beach. There are oak trees right now are dead along Las Virgenes because of the high concentration of that waste. You are good people here. Half of this audience belong to the Las Virgenes Water District. All due respect to you, the Las Virgenes Water District, what they do, you are good people. We have to live up to our environmental responsibilities. Our beaches are polluted. I get skin rash from swimming in these beaches since the early 80s, and I don't swim anymore there. I have to go to West New Zealand. We're really wasting a lot of potential in here. We have the potential of creating a reservoir to make the Las Virgenes Water District and customers totally water dependent on locally harvested water from our creeks and lagoons in this area. We can also enrich our environment and the creeks with that kind of project. We can make money by moving that Tapia treatment center somewhere into the mountains where the groves are, the lemon groves, and irrigate that water with the lemon groves where we have those sand mountains that can percolate that and clean that water.
What's your question?
My question is, why can't Las Virgenes District Water live up to your responsibility, come up with these facts, and acknowledge that these injections over the years that are causing these pollutants, that underground pollutants, our mountains and our geology is not different in all of these coasts. So all due respect to the reports, I have heard a lot of reports that are following up with this. Let's clean up all that. My question is, I want Las Virgenes to acknowledge their responsibilities and the history of this, and put a plan to clean this lagoon.
It's more of a statement than a question. Let him answer. Yeah, let him answer.
I'll respond to that. There's a number of issues raised here, but you know, like I mentioned, we have a state-of-the-art composting facility. It's been in operation since 1994. But prior to that time, the district did land apply its solids. And this is done throughout the state, throughout the country. In fact, many agencies continue to do this. The district and the Joint Powers Authority felt that this was not a sustainable practice, and many agencies are contemplating the same issue. You probably heard in Kern County that there's concerns about folks bringing their cake, as it's called, dewatered sludge to Kern County. The district invested $50 million in a composting facility, and so the district no longer land applies any of its treated solids. But with respect to that, there was sludge, treated sludge that was applied to the land, and there's an extensive monitoring system that's set up with monitoring wells where those nutrient levels that come from that area, which we call the farm, and there's three different areas. There's the south and the middle and the north. And if you're familiar with Malibu Creek and the Las Virgenes Road, you've seen it. There's an extensive network of monitoring wells where water quality can be monitored to evaluate the condition. Also, there was an effort at the direction of the Regional Water Quality Control Board where a very extensive study was needed in order to evaluate the potential impact of that operation on the creek. And that study was completed to the satisfaction of the Regional Water Quality Control Board. We continue to monitor that as part of that effort. But the effort showed, and the study showed, that through natural attenuation, that there is very little impact directly to the creek. But there are nutrients that do come from that facility, no doubt, there are. But it is being monitored closely, and those are attenuating over time.
I'm Glen Peterson. I'm with the Virgenes Municipal Water District. I've been on the board for 27 years. Lived here since 1967. And probably before any of you in this room, except maybe one or two, were here, the district was formed. There weren't any houses. There weren't any other pollutants out here. It was just all natural. And the district did one thing very important. They said, this is crap water. In Malibu Lakeside, they had a well that was called Old Stinky. And that tells you something about the quality of our water here. So we import every drop of water that we use in our community because of the quality of our creeks. You know, because our creeks would give us very, very poor quality of water to use. We're not like that. The city of Los Angeles is not like that. The Iceland Plain is not like that, but we are like that. We are very unique. One of the few watersheds in which there's very few wells that are used. And if they're used, they're in tributaries that are not part of the Modelo Formation. My question is very simple. Can you tell us how this process, when you set a TMDL in 2003 for nutrients, all of a sudden Heal the Bay, who's at suit with the EPA, is able to get another TMDL on nutrients? Tell us how transparent that was and how open to the public that was.
Sorry, I'm just trying to think. You had a couple of items I wanted to respond to. One is the 2003 nutrient TM was basically established by EPA. That's correct. When we looked at the data since then, 2003, there's been 10 years of additional data that we looked at. For the most part, what it's shown is that a lot of the implementations have been in place, particularly by the JPA, and there are still problems and nutrient enrichment, but also benthic macroinvertebrate community condition that's been basically negatively impacted. So since that time, as part of this process, we looked at all the information. You mentioned Heal the Bay. What happened was the state, both in 1998 and also in 2005 and 6, identified both Malibu Lagoon and Malibu Creek for potential impairment of benthic macroinvertebrates and then sedimentation. So I had explained earlier that because of that, we had to complete a TMDL to address those two listings of sedimentation and benthic macroinvertebrates. The way that you try to look at the science and identify the connection, and this was brought up by a number of different speakers, of looking at benthic macroinvertebrate condition is to then try to go backwards and figure out what's causing it. And so that's where we come up there. I had shown on the slide that there's many different causes and stressors, and we actually have looked at that. What under a TMDL process it does is it has to evaluate what are the pollutant stressors that can be addressed within the Clean Water Act. So that's not to say that only nutrients and or sediments are the only sources. And in fact, what the draft TMDL and what the final TMDL will say is the watershed actually has many sources. One of those is the geologic formation that was mentioned. One of those are wildfires, all of those that are mentioned. But it had to focus on the critical stressors, the pollutant stressors that needs to be addressed. And so that's, we've done basically a various analytical evidence approach to try to get to the result in this TMDL today.
My name is Manju Venkat, and I'm a local biologist. I was also a former member of the Regional Water Quality Control Board. I came just before you left, and I was one of the authors of the Basin Plan and set the standards for the Malibu Creek watershed. Dennis Washburn helped me with the field assessment. In fact, I remember 1994. I know the science behind water quality standards. I commend the state and EPA in what they are trying to achieve. But I'm speaking today as a local resident. Biology aside, I'm also a ratepayer. I commend the water agencies for what they are doing. It's a daunting task. And as with any watershed, we should be aware of our history. I compare this TMDL to Arundel removal. You know, we have had very sad results from Arundel removal, which is also a watershed effect, watershed task. Look at the Ventura Creek watershed. Millions have been spent on removing Arundel, but look at the streams back 10 years later. They're still Arundel. My point behind this is, unless there is a very sustained long-term effect or implementation, this is not going to succeed. The concern, again, stems from the fact, where is the funding? Who is going to give the money to the local agencies to undertake this? We're not talking about $10 million. This is beyond that. As with any state program, federal programs, often that part of it is forgotten. And the consequence is borne by the local agencies. Now, in setting the standards, we did what was called as use attainability analysis. You're familiar with that. As part of the use attainability analysis, economic constraints was a big consideration. Can a local community meet the standards, or a watershed meet its standards? What does it do? The parameters, apart from biology, physical, chemistry, geology, that needs to be maintained. Oftentimes, that is ignored. And I wish that the board pays attention to that in the state implementation.
A quick answer, the state provides funding through bond measures and propositions, and those monies are available to stormwater agencies, to wastewater treatment agencies, to non-point sources.
Yeah, you're talking out of your level when you say the word. You don't know what you're talking about. The state's broke. The state does not have the money.
Well, we'll get to it. Okay, we'll get to the next question.
My name is Marcia Halsley. I'm Executive Director of the Wetlands Defense Fund, and I have concerns, and a number of our people in our organization have concerns about how the organizations that are parties to the lawsuit influence the process for determining the TMDLs, just like was said by this young woman up here. And the reason is because you talk about poor biological communities, but at Malibu Lagoon, for 3 years, we've been told that the macroinvertebrates and the sedimentation is too much, and that this $20 million project or more is going to fix it. So why are we doing this again if those things are not fixing it? And besides the sedimentation that everyone is saying is a problem, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has just come out with a report related to the removal of Ringe Dam that says we don't have enough sedimentation in this watershed. So which is it? Do we have too much or not enough? And the biologists that we know, like some of the top biologists in coastal wetland restoration, Wayne Farron, says sedimentation is a natural thing in a marsh. Of course it is. It comes downstream and it fills in a marsh. That's how marshes are made, with sediment. So the sedimentation problem is a huge question in our minds. The macroinvertebrates are also a big question. Every time we asked which invertebrates are missing, which benthic invertebrates are missing, the only one that they said could be helped was the jackknife clam. The jackknife clam is a saltwater species. The lagoon is more freshwater. And when we looked at the technical appendices for the plan, it showed that there were plenty of freshwater invertebrates. Dragonflies everywhere in the summertime. So what is the problem? My point is, we would like to see biologists who understand the historical natural history of this region added to this process, that it's not just heal the bay and their associated experts. Because we had, at the San Fernando Valley Audubon Society, we had someone who did their master's thesis on Malibu Lagoon. He was completely shut out of the process. We had numerous biologists who asked to be part of the process, and they were completely ignored. Travis Longcore and Dave Jacobs are experts on the tidewater goby and the species that are part of these watersheds. And their new science needs to be included in this. So before we are ever getting to the TMBL standards being changed, that new science has to be part of it. And I think everyone in this room should be writing to their senators, their US senators, and their Congress members and saying, slow down to the EPA, do not do this until we get the science right.
So, as anybody from the Water District will tell you, I am one of the most critical people of the Los Virgenes Municipal Water District in the room. My name's Neil Ticktin. My name's Neil Ticktin. I live in Westlake Village. And as I hear a series of people, some of which are experts and have done a huge amount of research in a few places over here, there's obviously a lot of questions. The EPA has not been answering questions. I personally have asked the EPA questions and get back a reply, but I don't actually get an answer. I get an evasive answer on it. I think other people have found the same kind of thing. Tonight, the public couldn't actually see this on Agoura Hills television or other places because you guys aren't videotaping. That's why I brought a camera, because I'm going to post it on YouTube tonight so other people can see it. If you guys really want to be educated on this stuff, then if you want the public to be educated, you need to convey these things out there. But it's not just the questions that are in the room. You have questions. You, Cindy, have questions. You use words like, we believe, we think. We're trying to understand. That's how you describe the process that you went through. Not we know, we've concluded, or things along those lines. You actually said, we think, we believe. So before you go and spend I have a kid about to go to college, so everything is in college terms right now. Before you spend 1 to 2 years of my kid's college tuition to go do this, you better know what's going on. And that's what we would like to see.
Didn't know did you have a question?
What's the process that you're going to do in order to know instead of just shoving this down our throat?
I explained the process to this point. I'm sorry you feel that way. I'm sorry you feel the answers are based.
I'm sorry, does anybody in the room believe that she described a process?
No.
Thank you. So you're not communicating your process.
Okay, well I'm happy to communicate that process again. Which aspect would you like to hear?
How we're going to determine facts, not just your beliefs.
I didn't say that they were my beliefs.
You said, we believe, we are trying to understand. That's the words you used.
Yes, in the beginning. I also said that we looked at over 120 data sets, studies, and reports by all the various different universities Fish and Game, National Park Service. We looked at all of those. We actually used one of the best science looking at causal assessment. That's from the Office of Research and Development at Environmental Protection Agency. We can be...
Public service. Most of the work that's done in the United States...
Give him a microphone.
...done by private companies. You're talking about...
And some of those work has...
The greatest environmental disaster in the last 10 years occurred in the Gulf. And supposedly the Department of Interior and the EPA did the inspections there, and look what happened to the wildlife. They screwed it up because they didn't know what the heck we're doing. The EPA's track record stinks in all your studies, and you got a problem here. You were up here talking about, well, this was there, and that's what you were predicating your study on. What created the distilled water, the moving water? You never talked about that. You talked about one thing, and the next minute you say something else. I'm going to leave this room, and I'm going to say to you, as far as I'm concerned, this is a big boondoggle on the part of the state of California and the federal government.
I agree.
Hello? Oh, go ahead. I'm Hal Halsley, and I moved into this community in 1965. I have served with the Water District and I'm very proud of what they've accomplished here. This community would not exist because we did not have water that was potable water. In 65, if you took and watered a tree, you found a ring of salt around that. Because that's the kind of water that we have as a natural occurring water. The number of natural occurring wells, I think, is very, very minimal. I would remind you that we are dependent upon water. We bring that water in, that water takes and moves the salts now back into the creek because we've added more water. We've picked up those salts and they move to the creek. So this causes part of our problem. And I would say, when we talk about the natural disaster in the Gulf, we've had a natural disaster here. We had creek studies that have been brought into this community, and now we have mudsdales at those locations where those samples were being taken. And I think that we have that concern that we should be spending time on, not necessarily the salts and the algae. The algae form in sunlight. I think it's a very well-known fact. If you take a bottle of water, leave it in the dark, you don't get water, you don't get algae growing in that natural water. If you take stream water and you put it in the sunlight, you get algae growing. And so there are a couple of solutions. You could take and cover all the creeks with a canvas sail and solve the problem. Algae is the problem. My question is, what are we going to do for our natural disaster of New Zealand mudslides?
We might end up putting that on the impaired water rights list or something.
That's the answer.
I'm sorry, not right off the top of my head, but I know we're looking at that. I can get back a specific answer for you.
Are they edible?
My name is Ken Brown. I lived here since the early 80s. I'm basically a businessman. This is the first observation I had to this situation, and I'd like to give you my response and also with a couple of questions because I'm a pretty seasoned businessman. How much money has the EPA spent on this project? Do you know? I'm talking about everybody involved from the beginning of this situation.
I don't have an answer for you, but I can tell you that we have a team of 10 scientists working on this, along with working with the regional board and numerous other consultants.
What I have observed here is I think that the Las Virgenes Municipal Water District has done an excellent job in monitoring the situation. And I just question, even though there's federal laws, laws can be changed, things can be amended. What's the necessity of having the federal government involved when it looks like the local municipalities are really right on target and doing their job and they're addressing it locally, I think, very,
I would agree with you on that, actually. I think that Las Virgenes Municipal Water District has done a fantastic job of moving forward and making progress. And that's why, basically, I've spent a lot of time talking with Dave Pedersen, Dave Littman, and Carlos Reyes about what type of things we can incorporate so that it makes sense for your watershed, your district.
Thank you. The observation that I have is that we have salt issues, we have water issues that are algae issues. I know I get bottled water, and if I leave it out in the sun, algae grows in the water. So we have a cover over the water. And I think that's a very well said point. That's just the way it is. But I'm going to end with a little quick story. 25 years ago, my son, who was 5 at the time, we were hiking up in Sequoia, and we were exploring, and we came upon a cave, and at the end of the cave, as we were going into the cave, I heard rattles go off, and it was a rattlesnake. And my son was really concerned. I said, stop, don't do anything. We need to back out very quietly and gingerly, because we're interfering with nature. This is the rattlesnake's territory. And it seems to me that what's really happening here is that you have a natural evolutionary environment, and we're trying to tamper with it, and maybe we should do it within the guidelines of the local municipalities that are really doing what they can without upsetting the balance of nature.
Hi, I'm Jana Murphy, and I am on the board of the Triunfo Sanitation District, and therefore also the JPA board. And I just wanted to ask about setting TMDLs, if there's any, if you ever look at the associated cost, or there's some kind of cost-benefit ratio looked at all, or possibly maybe a realization that that is a wonderful goal, but the science isn't there yet to accomplish it, because to go from 8 milligrams per liter of nitrogen down to 1 is a huge, I mean, it's beyond what science can do right now. Thank you.
I should just also address the 8-to-1. One of the things that I've been working with Dave Peterson and his team is to describe and make more clear that it's not an 8-to-1, and actually that would be receiving water limit. We do understand that Las Virgenes Municipal Water District provides just a portion of the overall load, and so we have included what we call assimilative capacity, because we do understand that is a big part of it. So it wouldn't actually be to 1, and we've been in a lot of discussion about how to incorporate language so that it wouldn't be the way that it's been presented. Thank you.
My name is Andrew Sheldon. I'm here representing the City of Malibu Environmental Sustainability Department. And we have commented on the TMDL. We have a lot of technical questions that I'm not actually going to get into right now. But what I think is really important to look at in the TMDL is the target. It's something that hasn't really been brought up very much tonight, but the biologist, former regional board person who spoke earlier, said some things that really resonate with the thrust of our comments, and that we need to be looking at what target are we trying to go for here in terms of concentrations of nutrients and the richness of invertebrate species that are going to be living in the bottoms of these water bodies. Earlier, Jenny mentioned that EPA sets the target, region board sets the implementation process. If we don't have a target that's attainable, we're never going to get there through implementation measures. And the implementability of the target that we set is something that really needs to be looked at carefully in the TMDL process. We can spend 20 years trying to get there. We can spend, our kids' college tuition. We can spend, generations worth of dollars on this. But if we set targets that are not technologically achievable or economically achievable, we'll never get there, and a lot of money will be spent. So I don't have a question for you, but I just wanted to throw this comment out to the group. Thank you.
No, it wasn't a question, but thank you for that comment, and we will take that into consideration when we're writing the implementation plan. We often include reconsiderations, adaptive management, so we can look at the numbers over time, and that's something that EPA is.
Right, one of the things that we will include is discussion about really adaptive management, and because some of you have mentioned scientific data gaps, and we recognize the importance of that. So we will include guidance and language talking about incorporating when there's more new information and new science, that if that speaks to something different, that can then be incorporated and modified.
Dr. Lynn, my name is Steve Iceland. I am a member of the Triunfo board. I am in no way speaking for the board or my district at this point. I have spent my life also doing in different areas scientific investigation. I hold a dental degree from Washington University in St. Louis. I've done a residency for a year with the National Public Health Service, and I'm listening to your science and your science and your science and the district's science. There doesn't seem to be anything close to a consensus as to what is or isn't going to help the Malibu Creek watershed. I think we're all concerned with it. I've also, when you say that what the EPA looks at is to make the area fishable and swimmable, I've been on the board of directors of the Rancho City Recreation and Park District, so I have my interest from there also. I would ask for some reasonableness here. What most of the people in the room who have never been involved with a court consent decree are aware of is that there is a federal judge sitting there saying, do it. In fact, he's saying, do it 4 weeks ago. Would the EPA and Gilda Bay, the parties to the consent decree, since the original consent decree did not include the Malibu Creek watershed, be willing to do one of two things? Either go back to the original consent decree, which did not include Malibu Creek watershed, if the cities, our district, everybody else's district makes the same commitment to keep looking at the science to see if we can find something. Or, as the two parties to the consent decree, would you be willing to go together to the judge and say, hey, we need more time? Because short of that, we do have a court order that we're running on. So I'm asking for an answer from you and from you, ma'am, for a reasonableness to see if we can come up with something that will make the environment better and allow the people who live here, the 100,000 people who are served by the district, able to, literally, a small percentage of them, but some percentage of them, able to stay in their homes, because otherwise it is going to bankrupt people. So I'm asking for an answer from you and from you. Thank you.
First, I just want to thank you for acknowledging the challenges of a consent decree, because it really puts any entity or agency in a no, we can't do anything else. It really is a judge court ordered. If we don't actually meet it, we are in contempt of court. To answer your question, I know I can't answer you. That is something that basically our attorneys would have to be in discussion with different parties. But I can say that we've actually extended it because we heard the concerns. And this extension is something that we didn't have to go to a court or a judge to ask for permission. So that we decided that that was a good thing to do. We wanted to provide more information to the public. We do understand that there's a lot of questions, particularly because as you all heard, it seems like there's so many differences. I don't I would have to talk to our attorney. I mean, they would have to make the decision on that about, the next step would have to be going to our plaintiffs. It's not just Heal the Bay, it would be the National Resource Defense Council in addition to what's now called the LA Baykeeper, and make a request. And then if there's an agreement, then we would have to go to a court judge and make a plea, and that judge may or may not agree. But so I can bring this question back to our attorneys and have them think about it.
Maybe this works.
Yeah, just quickly, I'll address, basically, I echo what Cindy said, is that it would have to be decided by our attorneys, but I think, and as well as the other parties involved, so NRDC and LARWQCB. But again, it has been extended already, and I think we're, willing to have those conversations for sure.
Well, I've learned a few things tonight. My name is Damon Duval. I learned that we don't have any baseline data to even start from. That was quite amazing to me. You guys don't have a clue on where to start to get healthy water. I learned also that we've been injecting solids into wells over decades from this gentleman. We've got a history of really treating the water pretty bad. And unless we figure out some way to get a time machine that can go back before Tappan, back before Rock and Tine and everything upstream, back before the Ridge Dam, and get an idea of when this stream was healthy, which was about 100 years ago, you're not going to have an idea of what a healthy stream is. These are the target numbers. Steelhead used to run up that stream like every year, and they've been trying to do so ever since. So healthy numbers have existed, and you guys are headed in a direction where you're going to need to take it to the Halcyon Collider and see what happens and try to come up with some TMDs. You guys are reaching forward when the numbers in health have been established. So I think you need to look back to that's my opinion.
Good evening, I'm Len Polan, the newly elected director for the Virgenes Municipal Water District, and I have two observations and one question. The treatment plant is probably 1/3 or less from the ocean in terms of the entire length of the creek, and in terms of the entire watershed, it's much further south, if you will, than the rest of the watershed. My question is, if the water above the treatment plant is in such poor quality as per the EPA required National Pollution Discharge Permit, which was the report was filed in 2010, states that this water is poor, what difference will it make? If we take all we get out of the creek, we'll probably damage the creek because it needs the extra water because it is not a perennial stream. What difference will it make if we treat the water to better than drinking water? Thank you.
We're trying to address all the different sources. I agree with you, it's a concern upstream of Tappan too.
Well, what difference will it make if we get out of the creek? We can still be polluted.
Well, how will it treat the top of the dirt?
I'm sorry?
How will that treat the top of the dirt?
Not understanding your question.
That's what she's saying. The question is, well, how?
The discharge is only about 30%.
About 30 or less. That's
so to verify that, how does that help?
It doesn't help. What's going to help that is the LA County just tried to pass a $54 per parcel charge for us, as we all know, to start treating water because EPA is requiring it. But it won't make any difference to the creek, whether we're in the creek or out of the creek. So I think we're somewhat beneficial to the creek because we dump in water which dilutes the salts, and we keep more flow going. I find it strange that we're out of the creek with our recycled water when it needs it in the summertime. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to first say, first of all, my name is Rich Lawson. I've lived in Liberty Canyon, the wildlife corridor, for over 28 years. what I'm going to say, first of all, as homeowners, we all have a right to do with our property what we like, as long as it's lawful and it does not infringe on our neighbors. So that brings me to what might be an unpopular issue here with some residents. They talk about invasive plants. We have an invasive plant, the grapevine, which is taking over the Santa Monica Mountains. Those of you that are vintners, I'm sorry if I'm going to say a couple things here that I hope not to offend you. First of all, it's your property, you can do with it what you want. But it bums me out when I see 30 acres of chaparral totally skinned away, a needed environment for the wildlife. The next thing you'll see are 30 acres or more or less, whether it's 5, whether it's 2, whether it's 100 acres, it's hard to say. But the acres of vineyards that are proliferating through the Santa Monica Mountains cannot be healthy for this environment. One of the things, they talk about nutrients, fertilizer, urban runoff fertilizer. Well, I have a small home that I live in, and I do not use any fertilizer on my property. At all. I try to do it all naturally, all organic. I don't know if there's ever been any tests, or I don't know if there's ever been any studies, or I don't know if anyone's ever gone to a vineyard to ask them, how many pounds, or maybe tons, of fertilizer are you applying each year to have your award-winning wine? It's your right, I understand that. You can do that as a homeowner in the United States of America, as long as you don't infringe on others. Second of all, do the vineyards use pesticides? I don't know. All my plants are all controlled, the pests are all controlled by their natural predators. Thirdly, as I drive over the canyons, Mulholland and Canaan, there must be 300 acres of once was beautiful chaparral and wildlife protecting areas that are now gone. I'm not saying you can't do it. Do it. Grow your grapes. I saw something on Channel 7 for the big winer or the big home on the top. If you can't miss it, you can see it you can see the lights from over here in Chatsworth or anywhere else. And they were talking about their award-winning vines and their award-winning wines, and that's all good. Are you doing it organically? And I think a decision we should try to make here in the Santa Monica Mountains is that if you grow your wine, I like a glass of wine on occasion, but do it organically. If we could do that, if by the year 2020 had all the wineries in this area and the new wineries that are going to be growing, because I just saw a whole hillside scraped down clean. Let's do it all organic. I'm all for you growing your wine. I think you're allowed to do that. Do it organic, please. That's all I'm asking. Thank you so much. It will be a big problem. So I guess my question is, can the grapes be grown organically, completely, with no pesticides? Can it be done? Can it be done with no fertilizer? Can it be done? Can it be done with no Roundup on the ground? Can it be done? I think we can do it. We're all time.
Dave Peterson was just telling me that we have to be out of this room soon because of the requirement of the room. So we'll just take a couple of more comments, if you don't mind. Yes.
This plant is 22 years old. We've accomplished $2 billion worth of the effort that we set out at that time. But I'm inviting you at EPA, Cal EPA, Water Quality Control Board, Water District, Conservation District. The city is actually today received their bids for the enhanced watershed management plan that they're going to conduct. And that's at least a 2 to 3 year commitment on their behalf. So what I'm suggesting, and I'm asking you, can the EPA, can Water Quality Control Board join us in an effort to plan for the next 25 years so that we can do the proper assessments
in such a way that we don't bankrupt the community in order to accomplish enhanced watershed management? That's a question.
Yes, we will work with you for a long-term plan for water quality management. As I said before, regional board is going to be adopting the implementation plan to implement this TMDL, and we will be working with you guys to...
That doesn't answer the question.
Okay,
You're
sorry.
saying that we're agreeing to the fact that the Westlake TMDL and the Senate TMDL are co-opted. And that's what we're going to work on in terms of plan. I'm saying no. I'm saying there are at least 9 TMDLs in the watershed, and there are 91 in Los Angeles County or LA River that Calabasas has done in addition. So I'm saying let's comprehensively plan all of the TMDLs and then determine how we're going to allocate our resources to be able to accomplish the best compromise of all the work together.
Yes, I will also commit to doing that.
Can I ask a question? I'll speak loud. I'm the general counsel for Triunfo Sanitation District, but I'm not under any portfolio on that. I just had a couple questions sitting as a member of the public. I've been around the TMDL process for a long time, longer than I want to admit. It's never easy to understand. I don't know how the general public can understand it, but I spent a lot of time how to understand it. But just sitting here tonight, this is where I see us, and I'm going to get to a question real quick. Dave mentioned that we don't see a causal connection between nutrients, algae, and the community. You obviously do. So we've got a difference of opinion there, obviously. What do we do about it? Secondly, you've said basically the communities are real healthy in the Monterey Formation, where there's no other things. We're saying, well, we're not so sure about that. The state's also telling us we ought to recycle as much water as we can. What if we take all the water away from the treatment plant? Are those aquatic species going to do very well? Probably not. So my question is, what is the public takeaway from this tonight? Are you and the NGOs so sure of your position between now and May 24th that you're willing to spend these people's money to the tune of maybe $300 million? You were shaking your head earlier when David said that. I saw you going, no, no. So you've got a number in your mind. You think it's $10. I don't know what you think it is. But there's a lot of money. You're playing with house money. How sure that you've got it right? And it shocks me when Dr. Iceland asked you the question, did you ever think to talk to your attorney to go back to the plaintiffs and say, you know, we're not sure. They've raised a lot of good questions. A lot of time was spent in comment letters to you all. Did you just trash it? Didn't you say, we didn't think of that. Maybe we ought to think about it, and maybe we need a little bit more time. Pick up the phone, call your attorney, check with the other people, and say, can we give them another half a year to do this? That's what I think I would do if I was in your case. But when you're not spending your own money, you're really not motivated to do anything. So I'm asking the question, are you so comfortable in your position that what you heard from David tonight doesn't move you one way or the other, and you're going to roll on the 24th?
Let me just answer the question on whether we talked to our attorney. We did, which is why we went forward with the 60-day extension. And like I said before, it's not that we didn't consider that. We did. We're trying to move forward within the legal aspect. This additional 60 days was incorporated in the consent decree, where it could be a discussion just between the plaintiffs without a judge. And so all parties involved agreed that it made sense to extend it for 60 days. Beyond that, we would have to go to a judge.
I appreciate that, but are you really telling people that you're going to pursue that, you're going to argue for that, or are you comfortable in your position that if the attorney says no, then the 24th you're going to adopt this and basically say to the district and the other people who heard here tonight, no, we don't think the Monterey Formation is as big a problem as you think it is. We don't think basically that we think there is a causal connection. Is that what I'm hearing?
We're going to use the evidence and the data that we provided in TMDL and all the comments that all the people here or the public has provided to us. We will respond. We'll be incorporating comments that were provided to us and make corrections. Like I said, we're also working on what it means for implementation. We're incorporating implementation language that provides guidance on what that would mean. We've talked about a phased TMDL, recognizing that it's going to take time. So,
Time and money, you recognize that, it is going to take time.
Yes, I understand that there's going to be cost associated. I think, are we okay with it? Are we okay with it? Okay, so maybe just one more comment, and then we please.
We'll have him and then you last. I'm sorry.
I think a lot of people have made comments that they learned a lot here, and I think, again, my name is David Album, I'm a resident of Malibu Creek since 1996. I think it's a very valuable exercise in presenting different points of view. I think it's been well handled. The question I have is, I'm wondering, with the consent decree that the gentleman in the room really helped articulate the impact of that and really the loss of discretion that comes with that. I'm wondering why no one has, if there's any merit in raising this issue of questionable science, competing science, marginal benefit versus marginal cost, raising those issues with the NGOs as well. Because it's very easy to spend other people's money, and both the EPA is really in a position of looking to do that. The NGOs are really in a position of making people do that. And I'm wondering if that's not also an avenue that we can take away from this meeting, not just going to our representatives, but raising this issue with the NGOs involved, which there's probably a lot of members of those NGOs within the 100,000 people that are affected by this.
Lester, did you want me to respond on that issue?
Yes. I'd like to hear your answer.
What was the question that you had?
The question was why we're not just a question for you, I think it's a takeaway from the group, is why that's not a valid avenue for us and for people to leave this room and express their concerns, not just with our elected representatives, but with the NGOs themselves that are driving this process on their side.
No, I agree with you. That is a really valid avenue, which is why I think the regional board and the implementation plan process will be very extensive, and it will provide a lot more opportunities for public participation and discussion with other parties, the NGOs, or many other sources. And so that will take place. That will happen. In addition to that, I just wanted to also mention that in the TMDL, we have strong recommendations, and we're going to include language to speak to that too.
Yes, my name is Nancy, born in Westlake Village, moved here in '68. And Joe Bowman, I hope you'll see this. Thank you for your service for so many years. He was my mentor. We lived on Point 2, 1964 till, and my brother served, I served, Little Dune Beach, clean as a whistle, no rescue.
My question was no answer.
I'm saying that because the bird life is tremendous through this whole area. It's improved, it's adaptive, it's phenomenal. I see nothing in your studies or reports that suggests that the creek algae has harmed our birds. Where is it? Did you study that? Why? Birds are the thing that, the canary in the mine. Give me a break.
Not only that, they leave all sorts of sediment and nutrients in the water.
That's a good comment.
If the birds are not existing in the creek, then you've got the whole creek.
I should revise that. It's not that we didn't look at birds the way you're saying. It's that we did consider the birds, and we looked at the indicators representing the birds. So
How did you look at this?
We looked at the benthic macroinvertebrates, which are the food source for the birds.
No, please.
We looked at the benthic macroinvertebrates, which is a food source for those birds.
And there's plenty of it.
Thank you for your yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you everybody for being here tonight. Thank you.